Hello, folks. Sorry for the problem here of a late start. We had a bit of a technical glitch, but we're glad you're here. I'm Steve Chase, and I'm the manager of academic initiatives at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict, and I'll be the moderator for this webinar, presented to us by Evan Perkoski. You've seen in his introduction, so since we're starting late, I won't redo that. But I wanted to let you know a couple of things, is that we're going to be structured by the first half hour or so being the presentation by Evan. The second will be questions and answers. And there's two ways to make questions. You can write questions in the question box in the control panel that you see, and then we will be able to read those out and have Evan answer towards the end of the presentation, at the end of the webinar. The other way is if you click the raise the hand feature under attendees, we will be able to notice that, and we can unmute you and allow you to directly on air ask your question of Evan, and then we can have a conversation. So again, I'm very sorry for the delay because of the technical glitch, but I will turn it over now to Evan, and he can start his presentation. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Steve. All right, so let's give this a second shot here. So thanks everyone for listening in, for tuning in. Hopefully we get some good questions and feedback and discussions after this, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation. So the project today, what I'll be presenting, is based on a special report that Erica Chenoweth and I produced for the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. And the title of the report is Nonviolent Resistance and Prevention of Mass Killings During Popular Uprisings. And this is a peer-reviewed report that we wrote that's based on some of our ongoing academic research on the topic of mass killings and popular uprisings, both violent and nonviolent. So in that regard, because this underlying work is ongoing, I'm really looking forward to your questions, your comments, and hopefully we can improve this underlying paper as a result of your feedback today. And just briefly, if you're interested in reading this full report, in addition to the presentation today, in which I'll go over the main components, you can download this report from ICNC's website for free, but you can also order a hard copy for just a few dollars on Amazon. So to begin with, the focus of our report is how activists can stay safe when facing down repressive governments. And there are lots of ways that repressive governments can inflict pain and violence on their own populations, but the one we're focusing on in particular are mass killings. And we define mass killings in line with how most existing studies do and most existing data sets on this question. And so we define them as the intentional led or directed killing of 1,000 or more civilians in a sustained event. So there are two really critical components that separate mass killings from other acts of regime violence. The first one is that these are by government-led or directed forces. So it can be a state's form of military that's carrying out this mass killing, or it can also be paramilitary forces or militias that are somehow under their control, but it's not some sort of ethnic or community-based group that is operating independently of the government. That would not count. And the second key criteria is that there are over 1,000 civilians killed in a sustained event. And so therefore it has to be civilians and it can't be combatants. So say in the course of a civil war, if maybe 10,000 battle deaths occur, that would not count as a mass killing unless there were at least 1,000 civilians killed during that time period as well. And this data for mass killings that you're looking at right here from 1950 to 2013 or so comes from research by Jay Ulfelder and Ben Valentino on their own work on when and where mass killings occur. So if you look at the trend of mass killings over time, a couple of things stand out. So we see a pretty significant and steady increase of mass killings from about 1950 to their maximum in the early 1990s, when you did see a lot of conflicts taking place at the downfall and the end of the Soviet Union. Then you see that number decreasing until we reach a recent minimum in about 2010, where you had about a dozen or so ongoing mass killing events taking place. In the last couple of years, we've actually seen a surprising increase in the rate of mass killings, with a few more taking place, probably because we've seen a slight increase in the rates of both violent and nonviolent uprisings in the last couple of years. So the existing research on mass killings tells us, or gives us a little insight into why these events typically occur. And the existing research overwhelmingly focuses on two factors, what's often called threat and opportunity. In terms of threat, most research finds that mass killings take place in the context of violent uprisings, so civil wars, rebellions, insurgencies, and so on. And in this case, scholars argue that mass killings are used strategically by government forces in order to deter support and supporters away from the rebels. So in other words, a government might use mass killings against a population that's supporting a rebel group in order to deter that support and win over their support instead. So therefore, to deprive the rebels of the support of local civilians. And that's the threat side. And the opportunity side of the existing argument is that highly capable regimes often do this. And not just highly capable, but those that have certain types of regimes, often autocratic, led by military dictators or other personalist leaders. So existing research says that mass killings are most likely when you're facing some threat, usually a violent uprising, but also when you have a capable autocratic regime that's willing to use force in order to win the conflict. If you look at where mass killings occur and not just when they occur, you see that no region is really spared. So they take place in every region in the world. The lowest region or lowest percentage is Europe and Eurasia, roughly 10.6%. The highest is Africa at 29.5%, followed by East Asia and the Pacific at 19.7%. But these happen everywhere, and no single region is spared and not really confined to one place or another. And importantly, when mass killings peaked around the early 1990s, we also see a peak of violent and nonviolent resistance campaigns. And this data for violent and nonviolent uprisings comes from the major episodes of Contention Project, which is collected, the data is collected by Erica Chenoweth and a few of her colleagues. But this looks at basically large-scale violent and nonviolent uprisings that have certain sets of goals, so what we often call maximalist goals. They're seeking major changes to the political status quo, including regime change, territorial secession, or the ousting of foreign forces, often in anti-colonial conflicts. And importantly, in the early 1990s, we see high rates of both violent and nonviolent campaigns, popular uprisings using violent and nonviolent resistance techniques. But roughly in 2010, we see that percentage or that rate flip, where starting in 2010, you see nonviolent campaigns becoming more common and violence becoming less common around the globe. And the shift away from violence to nonviolence violence to nonviolence is significant for a number of reasons. And the main one being that the research finds that nonviolent resistance tends to have a number of benefits, both to the participants and to the governments and the stability of countries after this resistance takes place. So the first thing that research finds is that nonviolent resistance is much more likely to succeed than is violent resistance. So from Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, they find that nonviolent movements are almost twice as likely to succeed and achieve their maximalist goals as are violent campaigns that are similarly organized and structured. So this makes them much more likely to achieve ultimately their grand political ambitions. Second, research finds that nonviolent resistance, once again compared to violence, is more likely to produce democratic governments. So both even when they win, democracy is more likely to prevail. But interestingly, even if these movements fail, nonviolent movements are more likely to result in democratic gains in the near future and in the long term as well. And even another benefit is that nonviolent movements also tend to have a lower rate of recidivism. So even if they do fail, you're less likely to see a relapse into violence. Another interesting benefit of nonviolent resistance compared to violence is that individual acts of nonviolent resistance are less likely to elicit government repression. So in a really great ICNC monograph by Jonathan Pinkney, he finds that these individual acts of nonviolent resistance get repressed by the government in roughly 12% of cases, whereas it's 70% of cases for violent resistance. So the likelihood that you as an individual are repressed by the state in any form, from mass killings to local kind of backlash, is much lower when you're using nonviolent tactics compared to violence. And another final benefit of nonviolent resistance compared to violence is that it's much less likely to drag on. So the average civil war lasts around, or typically over 10 years. Some statistics argue that's around 13 years. but most civil resistance and nonviolent campaigns tend to last around 3 years. So they're much, much shorter, providing the government less time to conduct repression and for these things to go on and develop violent flanks and spiral out of control. So ultimately, there are lots of benefits to nonviolent resistance, and what we're trying to figure out if that benefit extends to mass killings in our case. We find some preliminary evidence that maybe nonviolent campaigns, in addition to all the benefits I just talked about, are indeed less likely to elicit mass killings by government forces. So if you look at violent campaigns in this major episodes of contention data, roughly 68% of violent campaigns elicited a mass killing from the government. So we're met with 1,000 or more deaths, civilian deaths by government-led or directed forces. Only 23% of nonviolent campaigns, however, managed to elicit those mass killings. So the likelihood, just on average statistics alone, of a nonviolent campaign achieving or having a mass killing levied against it by the government is roughly 1/3 the probability of that of violent campaigns. So there's some pretty good preliminary evidence that maybe there is something going on. Now, so why we have two kind of preliminary theories about why nonviolent campaigns tend to be safer in this way. The first is that if you are a regime elite and you order a mass killing against a nonviolent campaign, there's a pretty good chance you're going to experience some military defection. And so in this case, mass killings never occur. In the second case, regime elites might understand that if I order a mass killing, then there's a pretty good chance of defection. And once again, they might never order the mass killing to take place at all. So in both cases, you don't see a mass killing, either because a defection prevents it or because the fear of defection also prevents it. So we think that this relying on the agents, soldiers essentially, to use force, the different perspectives of them versus regime elites is what causes nonviolent campaigns to be somewhat safer. So the research questions that we're trying to answer in this project and in this report are twofold. So one, why do governments crack down on certain uprisings? And here we're not just focused on the big differences between violent and nonviolent campaigns, but we're looking at lots of different campaign level factors. So we're thinking about, are nonviolent campaigns with foreign support, for instance, more likely to be cracked down upon? Or maybe nonviolent campaigns where you do or do not get government defections and things like that. So we're looking at a number of campaign level factors and whether or not they influence the rates of mass killings. And our second question is, with that knowledge, how can nonviolent protesters remain safe? So how can these organizations structure themselves? Should they elicit outside support or not? How should they, what strategies should they take to limit the odds of a mass killing and ultimately remain safe when trying to take down these highly repressive governments? So to study this question, we begin with statistical analysis of violent and nonviolent uprisings and mass killings. So we basically take all the possible data we have on violent and nonviolent movements from the major episodes of contention project, and we combine that with all the data on mass killings from Ulfelder and Valentino, including where they happen, and when they occur, and how long they occur. So we look at all these characteristics of violent and nonviolent campaigns and mass killings from 1945 to 2013. And to analyze them, we use a method called Outofsample Validation. And this is actually a pretty simple method if you think about it. So basically, for Outofsample Validation, you take your data, for us, which is data on these uprisings and mass killings from 1945 to 2013. And we divide this into two parts. So the first one is what we call the training data set, or the older data from 1945 to roughly 2000. And then we have this prediction or out of sample population from 2000 to 2013. And then what we do is just run analyses on this older data, and we try to see, and we use that to generate predictions. So then we take our predictions from the old data, and we see how well it matches up to this out-of-sample prediction data set, the post-2000 cases. And then if we find that we're doing a good job of predicting those post-2000 cases, then that means we probably have pretty good insight into what might drive mass killings in the next couple of years, the most recent events. However, if we find that we're not doing a good job of predicting mass killings based on that older data, we can go back and refine our models and put in new variables or take out some variables. We can try to make sure we're getting better predictions in that post-2000 sample. And ultimately, by refining our models, we can increase that predictive power, do a better job of predicting these out-of-sample cases, and hopefully that tells us a lot about how, when and where new mass killings will occur. So ultimately, we find we separate our analysis into both country level and campaign level factors. So country level relating to the states, regime types, how long leaders have been in power, and campaign level factors, so things about the popular uprisings themselves I've talked about. So whether or not they receive foreign support, whether or not they're using violence or nonviolence. We're looking at whether or not these two different types of factors influence rates of mass killings. And interestingly, we find that both types of factors matter and give us predictive insight into when and where these events should occur. So first, in line with existing research, our findings really confirm what other scholars have found. We find that when it comes to predicting mass killings, regime type plays a really critical role. So we find that military-based regimes and party-based regimes are at a much higher likelihood of experiencing mass killing. And it could be that these two types of regimes are especially fearful of their downfall. They really hold on to power. And especially for military-based regimes, they might have a great grip and hold on the military, meaning that when they order a mass killing, they have very little fear of defection and subordination that might cause others to rethink those plans. We also find that characteristics of the individual leader also matter. So we find that leaders who have a longer tenure, who've been in office for longer, tend to be at an increased risk of conducting mass killings. But on the inverse, those who have experienced a recent coup tend to have a lower likelihood. So leaders who maybe have had a military threat against them in the last 3 to 5 years are less likely to try to use their military to crack down their own civilians. And again, it could be in these cases when military leaders have already experienced a coup, they're hesitant to use their military in a way that might once again lead to more defection and possibly incite another potential coup. In terms of the country level characteristics and kind of what's happening demographically, we find that population size is positively associated with the likelihood of mass killings. And this isn't all that surprising, since basically any measure, any type of political violence has a positive correlation with population size. Just bigger countries have a greater likelihood of all these different types of events. And then, not surprisingly, subgroup discrimination, which is a dichotomous variable, just binary, whether or not there is institutionalized discrimination in a state against some specific minority has a positive correlation. And this makes sense because if you have institutionalized political or economic discrimination, that might just be a precursor to using violence against that same population. And finally, the most significant country level factor that sheds light on whether or not a new mass killing should occur is whether or not the country had a previous mass killing in the last 5 years. And countries that had previously conducted a mass killing are at a much greater likelihood of doing it again. And it could be that these leaders have learned that their military forces will carry out their plans. They might have the kind of coordination and plans in place to basically do it again. So for all these reasons, it makes it easier essentially to carry out another mass killing when a leader has conducted one in the past. And so the more innovative aspect of our research is looking at these campaign level factors. So we already know a lot about the country level factors, and our research basically confirms what other scholars have found. What we add to this discussion is this campaign level analysis, and showing that it's not just violence or nonviolence that matters, but lots of different dynamics of the uprising itself influence what governments do and how they respond with or without violence. So our first and most significant finding is that the method of contention really does matter. Violent campaigns are at a much greater rate of mass killings, and nonviolent resistance tends to lower that odds. And this is exacerbated by military defections. So nonviolent campaigns that can elicit military defections from the regime are at the lowest likelihood of experiencing a mass killing. And combined, when you have civil resistance techniques with defections, that lowers the odds of mass killings by roughly 88%. So a non-trivial, very significant amount that stems from civil resistance techniques with eliciting these military defections from the existing regime. In violent campaigns, it's not all that surprising, as we mentioned, that the existing research finds that mass killings are much more likely when regimes are facing this existential threat to their personal and organizational survival. And these mass killings are a way to turn populations away from the rebels and bring them back into the fold of the government forces. And the other factor we find that matters is what the uprising is trying to achieve. As I mentioned, we're looking just at campaigns with maximalist goals, so those including regime change, territorial secession, and kind of ousting foreign troops from a given country. And those seeking regime change, not surprisingly, are at the greatest risk of mass killings. Makes sense because these campaigns are specifically targeting the regime. They're a threat to their continued rule, whereas secession and removing foreign troops is not really an existential threat for regime elites and their families and their supporters. And a really interesting finding from our research concerns foreign state support. And this is a measure of whether or not a campaign is receiving financial or military assistance from a foreign state. And we find that that material assistance is positively correlated with mass killings. In other words, the same campaign that has foreign support is much more likely the same campaign that doesn't have foreign support to elicit a mass killing by the state. And there are a couple of reasons why this might be the case. The main one we think is that when a movement receives foreign support, it tends to look much more threatening to a regime elite, to regime elites and their military agents, so security forces, police, etc. And when you have that foreign state meddling, the perception of meddling in domestic affairs, it might mean that when the security forces get that order to carry out a mass killing, they're much more likely to actually do it. Compared to a situation where there's no foreign state support and it's a grassroots movement, that case might seem much less threatening. The opposition might seem like it's doing something for the greater good of the country rather than being controlled by a foreign state. And therefore, in cases where you do have that foreign backing, it somewhat makes sense that mass killings become more likely from the regime's perspective. And so using this method of out-of-sample validation, we do something that's essentially list-wise deletion or stepwise deletion of our variables. So in other words, we construct a model of mass killings on that training data, and we use it to predict the out-of-sample mass killing events. And then we remove one variable at a time, and we see what happens to our predictive power. If we remove, for instance, whether or not a recent mass killing occurred from our model, and our predictive power goes way down, well, that means that the recent mass killing variable is giving us a lot of predictive insight, and that should stay in that model. So we remove every single variable one at a time to see if our predictive scores go up or down. And by doing this, we can rank each individual variable in terms of how much it adds to our predictive power. And so this chart shows you the top 10 predictors that impact the odds of mass killings. So in other words, when we remove them, which ones add the most predictive, or which ones give us the most predictive power? The one that has the most significant effect is, as I mentioned, whether a recent mass killing has occurred. This sheds the most light on whether another one will take place, and it gives us the most insight into when and where these events will occur. Then we see another country-level characteristics, whether or not it is a party-based regime, and that once again makes mass killings more likely to occur. But then we see a few characteristics of the campaign itself. And this really underscores how both structural conditions and campaign dynamics work together to influence rates of violence in a state. And here we see the external support to just the campaign and whether or not that campaign is seeking to overthrow the government. Both are positively associated with mass killings, and both really shed a lot of light on when and where these events should occur. Then we see a few more structural variables, so population and the number of coup attempts in the past 5 years, whether it's a military-based regime, and whether there's subgroup discrimination. And then we see whether or not nonviolent campaigns and military defections are occurring. So once again, if you are using civil resistance techniques and you manage to pull the military away from the regime, and that's followed by multiple concurrent resistance campaigns. And these are cases where you have maybe multiple violent campaigns or violent and nonviolent campaigns active in the state at the same time. And it's important to know that the way that the data is constructed, these would be two totally separate campaigns. So it might be one campaign to overthrow the government and another campaign to secede territorially from the state. But in these cases where you have multiple ongoing resistance campaigns, that probably poses a much greater threat to regime elites and increases the odds of mass killings taking place. So what are the implications of all this research for policymakers and activists? There are a few important things that people should take away and a few very concrete policy implications. So the first is that maintaining nonviolent discipline is key. So we find that nonviolent movements tend to be at a much lower risk of eliciting mass killings and state repression. And so there are a couple of things that activists and outside actors can do. So first, from the activist perspective, maybe focus more on training and incentives to maintain that nonviolent discipline among your members. And foreign states can also help by giving training and other incentives, such as recognition, contingent upon maintaining nonviolent discipline throughout the course of the uprising. And so we also find that nonviolent campaigns that experience military defections are at the lowest odds of mass killings. Nonviolent campaigns should really seek to pull away military members from the state apparatus. And here, maintaining nonviolent discipline will really help. So existing research shows that nonviolent movements tend to get defections at a much greater rate, which is good for these nonviolent campaigns in terms of staying safe. But nonviolent campaigns can do other things to make this more likely. They can try to actively forge bonds with the armed forces. They can try to highlight their shared connections and shared history and ancestry. They can also try to draw from multiple segments of society. So you don't want to be just relegated to one small group, but you want to make sure that if someone from the military looks out upon the crowd, they see faces they recognize and people they possibly know, and that'll make them think twice about using violence against these movements. And this is another area where outside forces and actors can have an effect. So foreign states, for instance, in the short term, can think about providing funds to support relocation and military families that want to leave the regime. So making it easier for military agents to leave the state, encouraging these defections. In a longer term, states can think about encouraging democratic norms and the respect for human rights among their military counterparts in other states. So research also shows that foreign state support is positively associated with mass killings, and this suggests that states should avoid this visible material support unless it's really necessary. And especially these activists, if they should really only accept foreign visible economic or material assistance when it's really critical to their campaign, but otherwise they should think about how foreign states can help them without being so overt and raising the threat posed possibly to regime elites. And here states can think about contributing in less overt ways. They can think about knowledge sharing, capacity building, so ways to help maintain nonviolent discipline among these organizations they support, but not to get involved directly and not to make it appear like the movement is perhaps a puppet of a foreign state, because that can once again bind regime elites with their military agents and make defections less likely and mass killings more likely. And finally, in the long term, states should address, and outside actors, NGOs, etc., should address the structural roots of violence. The research on political violence, and including this report, finds that certain factors like inequality and subgroup discrimination are positively associated with lots of different types of political violence. And reducing those is one way to limit the odds that violence takes place whatsoever. Also, in the long term, states can think about supporting human rights and things in the peaceful transitions of power and democracy, and in that sense, reducing the need to have these uprisings at all in the first place. So ultimately, this report sheds light and it gives us insights into what policymakers and activists can do both in the short and the long term. And our findings about campaign dynamics suggest that lots of this stuff can be affected when we think mass killings are imminent. So with that, thank you very much. And we look forward to your questions and comments and hopefully help improve this project as we move forward.
Thank you so much, Evan. And I just want to remind the people who are participating in this webinar that there are two ways to pose questions. One is that you can, if you have a microphone or a telephone ready and you click on the raise hand button, and it's the small button with the hand icon on the side panel, that will alert us that you have a question. I can then unmute you, and then you could ask your question directly to Evan, and then he could respond. The other way to ask a question is by typing it into the question panel at the right of your screen. I will then read all the written questions I can over the question and answer period, and Evan will have a chance to answer. And I just want to say that we will try to get to as many of these questions as possible, but if there are some left over before we end the webinar, we will send those to Evan and he'll do written response, and we'll put them on the webinar's webpage along with the recording of this webinar, which you could access and then share with other people if you like. But we already have some questions, so let me quick look for them and ask them of you, Evan. First off, this is sort of about the method, but it has implications, I think, on the findings. Is that one participant is asked, did you take into account the length of an uprising? So if mass killings are defined as 1,000 civilians being killed by the government, is that 1,000 killings over, like if the uprising takes months or years, or is it a single time? So can you give us a sense of how you dealt with different lengths of uprising and in the relationship of defining mass killings?
Sure. So probably not surprising to many of you who are listening, but data on mass killings and finding information about specifics of mass killings is really difficult to come by. So for this project, we relied on the best available data on mass killings, which is unfortunately relegated basically to country years. So we know, for instance, that in India in, say, 2002, for example, there was an ongoing mass killing that may be extended for 3 to 4 years. But we don't know when the actual deaths were taking place. We know there was in this time period, but we don't know if, say, 10,000 occurred in the first year and only 1,000 thereafter. So we're limited in terms of what we can know, but we do have data on how long these events occur. But for us, we did not focus on, really our dependent variable is just whether or not a mass killing was taking place during one of these uprisings, but we didn't focus on too much on how long the mass killing occurred. A related question might be whether or not the length of the campaign is also associated with mass killings. In that sense, you can imagine that longer campaigns maybe appear more threatening, more intractable, giving the state more time to launch a mass killing. I don't think we found any significant effect from that duration of the campaign in our analyses. And it definitely didn't feature into our top 10 predictive variables. So in that sense, we don't really find that the campaign duration matters too much. We're kind of not really focusing so much on the duration of the mass killing, just whether or not one was taking place during these uprisings.
Great, thank you. Now we have another question from a participant who heard you use the phrase a few times that nonviolent campaigns for these maximalist goals are much less threatening to the regime. Mm-hmm. And so wanting to tease out a little bit of what you meant, because given that nonviolent campaigns are twice as likely to be effective, one way to look at that is that they're twice as threatening to the rule of certain elites. So is it that you're just talking about because there's no physical threat, that they're less threatening that way, even though they're more threatening to the viability of the regime? And so that person just wanted to hear a bit more of what you were meaning by much less threatening.
Yeah, it's a great question, and something I definitely wasn't super clear about. So when I think about, or when we're thinking about threat in this context, we're thinking really about personal safety. And you're absolutely right that nonviolent campaigns can be considered more threatening to regime elites because they're more likely to succeed. But oftentimes when you see nonviolent movements succeed, the regime elites can stay relatively safe. They can flee to another country. They can often even stay within their own country, but relatively exiled. There's a very low threat of regime elites and their families being killed by a nonviolent uprising. In violent campaigns, that's the opposite. We've seen in many recent campaigns from Muammar Gaddafi to Saddam Hussein, these leaders tend to have not so great endings compared to what might happen in a nonviolent movement. Excuse me. And the other thing is that from the perspective of the regime's agents on the ground, so for instance, security forces, nonviolent campaigns are once again much less threatening personally to them. So if you're on the front lines and you're a soldier and you're ordered to control crowds at a nonviolent movement, well, you're probably facing a very low threat of personal safety. However, if you're on the front lines facing a violent insurgency or rebellion, then yes, there's a great risk to your own personal safety and your life. And there's a lot of research in political science and sociology that shows that violence has these kind of cohesion building effects, that when states are attacked or when they're facing violence, that tends to cause an upswell of support for regime elites and kind of this cohesion develop between regime elites and their military agents. So using violence against the state is both more threatening from a personal perspective, and that tends to make the regime elites and their security forces work together much more and try to work for their own personal safety. And in that case, if the regime elite orders a mass killing, well, then the security forces might think it's in their own best interest to follow through. And nonviolent campaigns tend to not have that problem, tend to not inspire that cohesion in the same way. And yes, while they're threatening from the perspective of the organization and the regime, they're not really threatening to regime elites and the security forces.
Great, thank you. Now we have somebody who's raised their hand, and I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, but Janice, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question. Oh, I think you're self-muted, so you'd have to unmute yourself. So while we're maybe waiting for that, I can ask another question here. Can you discuss how peaceful resistors or nonviolent civil resistors could best try to prevent or lessen the impact of regime infiltrating the movement with violent actors to create a justification for repression?
So that's a really good question, and it's a very practical on the ground question that I personally don't have much insight into. I'm not really involved in lots of that research, but absolutely that is a big concern for activists and for organizers are what often are called these false flag operations. So it can be a terrorist attack that the state commits or funds, and that is then attributed to a nonviolent movement in order to justify, exactly as you said, the use of violence against a nonviolent movement, and for the state to then kind of discredit the organizers and say, look, they're already using violence, so we have a justification to crack down. I think it's going to be incredibly difficult for organizers to prevent these things from taking place, but making sure that your events are tightly controlled, that you do have lots of training, you're trying to build discipline among your own agents is what you should be focusing on. And while I don't think you can limit the possibility of these events taking place and any infiltration whatsoever, you can do your best to, on the whole, maintain nonviolent discipline and prove that, yes, you might have a fringe element or some people who are launching operations, but you can quickly disavow that and show that you are not training or working with these individuals. So unfortunately, I don't have much more kind of on the ground knowledge to share with you, but I think trying to maintain nonviolent discipline to disavowing those activities and showing what you're doing and how committed you are to nonviolent techniques is going to be critical.
Great, thank you. I have another written question here. And the person asks, if nonviolent uprisings are more likely to result in democratic gains, do you think we will see, and this is asking you to predict based on your data, do you think we will see more nonviolent campaigns existing in the future or a major uptick in politically violent ones?
That's a really good question. And so it requires me to be predict a bit or think about what I imagine is going to happen in the future. But I think based on currently available trends, I think we are seeing the rate of nonviolent movements increase compared to violent conflicts. And I'll go back to a slide we had earlier looking at the rates of violent nonviolent campaigns over time. And we do see that as of about 2010, nonviolent campaigns have become more common. And I think with the internet and with the easy diffusion of information in the 21st century, you're likely to see this trend continue. Because as people recognize that nonviolent campaigns have been effective, as the research gets out and the findings that nonviolence can succeed and can create these lasting democratic gains, it would make sense that as a strategic actor, when you evaluate your options for overthrowing a state or for seceding, you choose the one that has the evidence that backs it up. And in that case, it is nonviolence. And I think we are seeing that more and more. I think there's evidence that lots of activists from Venezuela to Syria to other cases have been trying to use and apply these nonviolent principles because there are so many benefits to doing that. And I think you're right that this trend should only increase in the future as more people learn about it and as these ideas diffuse.
Great, thank you. Now we have somebody who's raised their hand. Let's see if we can get them. So Ben, you're up. I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question.
Wonderful. Thanks, Evan. This is fascinating. I've got, I guess, a sort of three-part question. So if I understand correctly, you're counting nonviolent protesters as civilians. So that's to say that when opposition movements are entirely nonviolent, there are effectively no quote-unquote combatants on the movement side. So that would mean that all deaths, including deaths of activists, would count as civilian deaths within the sort of mass killing 1,000 threshold. And so the first question is just, am I understanding correctly? The second is, I imagine there would be data issues, but would you expect in future research to try to distinguish between deaths of nonviolent protesters and deaths of bystanders or of civilians who are not engaged in nonviolent action? And then the sort of third part is, to what extent would you think that distinction even matters?
That's a great question. One we've grappled with. From the perspective of researchers, as I'm sure many of you are aware, you sometimes have to rely on existing data because you can't collect everything you want. It just takes too much time and too much money. So in our case, we are relying on data on mass killings from Ulfelder and Valentino, who, as you mentioned, and as I talked about earlier, their definition of mass killing is about civilians. And I think their distinction there is for whether or not the people who are killed are combatants or not, typically in violent conflicts. So you're right, it probably is not distinguishing between activists and civilians in this case, because from their perspective, they're probably the same thing. They're not armed combatants, so they would therefore be counted the same in their definition of mass killings. We haven't really thought about getting more data on that, but that's a great point and something we should look into, and I'll see whether or not. I don't think the data from Ulfelder and Valentino does disaggregate that in any way that's useful for distinguishing between nonviolent protesters and resistors and civilians who are totally unengaged with the movement. But I really think that if anything, we should expect the statistics to be more troubling than they actually are. So if you looked at these basic averages, let me try to pull it up here. So if, for instance, this distinction really did matter, then you would imagine that nonviolent campaigns would actually have a higher rate than is observed here for if you distinguish between nonviolent activists and simply civilians. But because it is quite low, it makes me think that maybe this isn't too much of an issue, and that if we disaggregated it, you might actually see that percentage go down, suggesting that nonviolent campaigns are perhaps even safer. So I don't think it works against us, but if anything, it might make more of a distinction and create a larger gap between the odds of mass killings and violent and nonviolent campaigns.
Great, thank you. And now I'm going to unmute another participant who has a question. So Zara, please go ahead. Zara, are you there? Okay, I'll move on to a written question then, and then check for other people who might have raised their hands. So one question is, what is the role of political economy in explaining state responses? So when you're getting back to country-specific analysis or more conditions versus the strategy of movements, were you able to look at what types of economic elites, types of economies or economic relations might impact whether or not there would be mass killings in response to an uprising as a form of repression?
It's a really good question, really interesting one that I think some scholars have been recently working on. So thinking about the role of economic elites in violent and nonviolent campaigns, And there's some really great work by Elizabeth Jean Wood at Yale, who looks at the role of economic elites in ending the conflicts in South Africa and Honduras, or maybe another case, I can't remember exactly, but she does great research on that. So absolutely, political economy factors matter. The economic elites do have a role. We didn't look too much at political economy in this analysis. We do have a number of factors at the country level that capture a few political economy characteristics, such as infant mortality rate, which is somewhat of a catch-all. I think we have whether or not it's a major oil exporter, and possibly something, their openness to foreign trade. We didn't find that these factors were too significant. And some of them, I think, were positively correlated with violence. But as we find in most of the political violence literature, lots of these factors are endogenous and correlated with one another and correlated with the outcome we're interested in. You often do see more violence in countries that have lower incomes, lower standards of living, and larger populations. So it's tough to disentangle what's really doing the work there. But another issue with studying these political economy factors is that they're really slow moving. And that was one of the main impetuses for this project, is that a lot of the research on mass killings currently focuses on these really slow moving structural indicators like population or regime type that take years and if not decades to influence, whether or not you even can influence them. But the campaign dynamics give us insight in basically real time into what might happen and what we can possibly do. So while I think the political economy factors do play a role, our kind of main focus is on these campaign dynamics. But definitely economic elites and types of economies are significant in these cases.
Great. And now we have another questioner who has their hand up. So Alfonso, I'm unmuting you. Feel free to ask your question. Oh, you're self-muted. You're going to have to unmute yourself. There. Okay, you can go,
Hi.
Alfonso.
Hi. Hello. Can you hear me?
Hey, yes.
Hello. Thank you. It was a really good insights about this, and I just want to ask that the focus is more on state actors and the military, but what we have seen in cases like Colombia or Mexico is that mass killings have been made by non-state actors. So how this can be of help also in this kind of context where you are not facing the government or the militia, in the regular militia, but some kind of cover actors supported by the state, but they can do this kind of atrocities, and this that have happened like many times in Colombia, for example. So how do you approach these also, or do you have some findings about it?
Thanks. That's a really great question, and it's something that Erica and I are actually working on for our next project. So trying to collect more data on who commits the mass atrocities and the mass killings. So right now, the data we're relying on typically does focus primarily on state actors, but really the definition is state-led or directed forces. So in this case, if it was a militia or guerrilla group that was aligned with the government, it would be counted in the data set as a mass killing, and we would be analyzing that. But we are, thinking about the possibility that the dynamics of mass killings committed by non-state groups that are independent versus those that are allied with the state are probably going to be a bit different from whether or not it is just the state's regular military that conducts these operations. And obviously our theory about defections and the fear of defections playing such a significant role is going to apply most to cases where a state is using its form of military to commit a mass atrocity. But I think from the perspective of our findings, we do include cases where there are government-affiliated or regular forces carrying out the mass killing. But the next step of our project is going even further to think about when it is maybe unaffiliated non-state actors, or thinking about the differences of the dynamics between the affiliated non-state actors and the state's regular forces. But I think even in cases of related research from political violence, there is work that suggests that the benefits of nonviolent campaigns in terms of remaining safe does extend to simply one-sided violence by non-state forces. And that typically looks at a lower threshold of violence, but it's something in our future project that we want to integrate on and continue working on.
Okay, thank you.
So yes, thanks. And since we started a little late, I think we'll go at least about 5-6 minutes over because we still have people wanting to ask questions. So the next person who has electronically raised their hand is Vladislav. So you're unmuted, Vladislav. Go ahead and ask your question. Okay, I guess that's not gonna work. So let me ask another written question. So we have, well, we have many messages that say thank you for this research. Um, and then this person says, I find telling people just to protest nonviolently can be irresponsible when mass killing is likely. So following the policy implications, it seems a bit cyclical when mass killings are likely to ask people to change the structural roots. How can this be done when mass killing is likely?
Yeah, so in this project, we're not so much focused on the structural roots of violence, which addressing those is definitely a long-term problem and consideration for states that can expend more money over many years to try to change some of these fundamental characteristics that are associated with violence. But we're saying that if you have the option and you're trying to overthrow a regime and you are decided upon using violence and nonviolence, or one of the two, our research suggests that if you go down that nonviolent route, there is a lower odds of a mass killing taking place. And a lower odds does not mean no odds whatsoever. So we're not saying, we're not trying to say that you are going to be safe if you do X, Y, and Z. It's just that in these cases across, since 1945, looking at all these different campaigns, these different dynamics of mass killings, those that go the nonviolent route tend to be a bit safer and have a lower chance of eliciting a mass killing by the government. And it's not to say it won't reduce the odds completely down to zero. But in addition, there are other steps that nonviolent protesters who want to overthrow a repressive regime can take. They can try to get defections. They can try to get regime elites to turn against the regime, from economic elites to many others, from the ministers and judges who might have an effect and can maybe pressure the government, down to the individual soldiers who we find have a very significant effect. But in contrast, using violence gives the regime lots of opportunities to use violence and lots of justifications for doing so. And so once again, this is not saying that nonviolence is going to bring the odds of a mass killing down to zero, but comparing the same campaign that chose nonviolence compared to violence, I think most of the research, including ours, would say there are lots of benefits to that. You're going to be safer than if you had gone down that violent route.
Excellent. We have another question, which is somewhat about methods, but it's also, I think, pretty practical, is that in your slide that we're looking at with violent campaigns or nonviolent campaigns, part of the reality is that it's very rare that violent campaigns are completely violent and don't use any civil resistance tactics. It's also somewhat rare for predominantly nonviolent campaigns not to have some people who, out of fear or anger, spontaneously give up nonviolent discipline, at least for a time, as well as organized violent flanks. And so the person's just wondering, in those messy areas where there's a range of tactics being used, how do you determine and code for what is a violent campaign versus a nonviolent campaign?
That's a really good question. And so from the major episodes of contention data, they try to specify the predominant tactic being used by the campaign's leaders and being kind of espoused by the campaign's general strategy documents and strategy kind of discussions. So in that case, campaigns that say we are trying to use nonviolent tactics and we are a nonviolent resistance organization, they might surely develop, as you said, a radical flank or some violent movement that operates alongside it. But the campaign predominantly is seeking to use nonviolent tactics. So in that case, we would code it as a nonviolent campaign, but one that has a radical flank. And so we do code for some of those in-between cases. On the other hand, for violent campaigns, Once again, we're looking at whether or not the campaign is seeking to achieve their political change through predominantly violent tactics. And that's something that's usually pretty clear to see and to outside observers. But we haven't focused too much on concurrent nonviolent campaigns. There's other research that suggests that violent campaigns that operate alongside nonviolent movements tend to lose a lot of those nonviolent benefits, because once again, it gives the state a justification to crack down, which is much harder to come by when you're facing a purely nonviolent movement. And the same thing is even true of nonviolent movements that have radical flanks, that you tend to lose some of those benefits and if you had remained entirely disciplined to nonviolent tactics. So we try to get around this issue by coding for whether or not a nonviolent campaign has a radical flank. And that'll give us, from if there is some violent action alongside a nonviolent campaign. In terms of violent campaigns, we have looked at whether or not there is a concurrent nonviolent campaign. We didn't find much effect. Though we did in our analysis distill that down to a dichotomous indicator of whether or not you see multiple ongoing campaigns, regardless of their method of contention. Whenever you have multiple campaigns, mass killings and other threats and other uses of force become more likely, probably because it poses a greater threat to regime elites. So we try to get around in a couple ways, but there's lots of research on this that suggests that these mixed campaigns tend to lose the benefits of both.
Okay, I think we're going to have to finish up fairly soon, so I will ask one more question and then we'll close out. And then for the remaining questions, I just want to let all the participants know that I will be sending those to Evan and he'll write responses, and then we're going to update the webpage about this webinar to include the recording of it, as well as additional questions. So I would say for people who have burning questions that haven't typed them in yet, this would be a good time so we can pass them on to Evan. But Evan, in terms of a last question, one person who wrote in from Bolivia is talking about how they're putting their strategic effort on building relationships with the police more than on the army, because the police seem more sympathetic and have made pronouncements in favor of citizens. And so that's their strategic approach, is that it's the low-hanging fruit among army versus police. But the person's wondering, when you studied any of the case studies in this, were there times where police went up against military, or the military split and where different factions were going at each other? And does that have the danger of generating more violence, or what relationships did you see in cases like that?
That's a really great question, one that's tough to answer, because the data we're using focuses on military defections which are not disaggregated between security force like the army and the police. But I think there are a number of cases where you've seen the police side with protesters and parts of the military, in particular, say, regime elites, personal guard, or highly trained operational units, will never really leave the regime elites. But I think in those cases, what determines the final outcome is where the majority of sympathies lie. So if you have just a small segment of the police that probably won't have the benefits of saving you from lots of the regime violence, but if you can slowly work from the police to some members of the military to keep working your way up and slowly turn the tide, then that can ultimately have a pretty significant effect. And I think lots of these dynamics are what are often called kind of cascade dynamics. So that if you see some people defecting and siding with the opposition, so where there's just the police, you might then see in a couple months members of the military who, when they're ordered to use force, maybe think twice, because they've already seen some of their friends in the police forces defect and join the opposition. So it's not to say that these things are totally irrelevant or that one won't inspire the other. I think getting any defections is likely to lead to more defections. But there are cases where these things do split, where you see some members in the military go to one side and some to the other. But I think having defections at all makes regimes think twice about using violence. It makes them wonder how, whether or not they'll be supported by their armed forces if they order them to do something awful. So I think the strategy of starting from police and building up is a great one. And I think, like I said, many times, even a few defections, when people see that, it'll inspire more defections and lead to more and more.
Okay, Evan, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to lay out your research, talking about the practical implications, and I want to thank the participants. I thought this was a great series of questions. I actually have a number of more here that I will send on to you, Evan. And I just want to let people know that after I shut down the webinar, you'll be prompted to fill out a survey, which is fairly quick, and we would love your reactions to this webinar and various ways that we can improve things. But I just want to thank everybody for participating, and Evan, thank you so, so much.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks for organizing.
Okay, take care, everyone.